Hey there folks, and welcome again to another vlog of Tag Along with Chet. And we're going to continue on with the episodes of Hangar Chet-Chat, and this will be episode 7. So Mike, stand by, because here it comes. Okay, hi folks, it's Chet from Tag Along with Chet. And we're on episode 7 of Hangar Chet-Chat. So I'm going to get comfortable. And here we go. As most of you know, I started flying in '67, where I got my private pilot's license with a gradual, with hope that I would at some point in time be hired as a flying commercially. It didn't happen, folks. Things were like this. I had friends of mine that worked with the airline that were laid off. They went and got contract jobs overseas, and with a hopeful callback at some point in time. And I know one of my buddies ended up as a contract pilot in Malta, and he was there for 2 years with a 2-year contract. So things were not looking good. So I finally decided that I wasn't going to pursue it anymore. It meant I'd have to forego all my seniority that I already had as a dispatcher, and I was pretty well halfway up there at that point. So I didn't want to jeopardize that. So I said that was it. Now, mind you, that's not to say I didn't continue on as time went on with trying to upgrade my license, and that was for a totally different reason, and we'll get into that later. But as it was with CPR, I stayed as a flight dispatcher throughout my whole career. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, the chap I was working with, Mike. Now, you'll probably remember Mike from some of my previous I think the previous one I mentioned something about the fact that I was going to be talking about this trip. And it was an exciting trip, this one. This one was really good. And Mike will attest to that. If you want to get a hold of him, he lives in Australia. So, hi Mike. You got to come up here. Oshkosh is coming. Anyway, Mike and we left on August the 22nd in the J3. Now, as you heard from previous comments that I made, Mike had probably 15-20 hours of stick time in my Cub, and he landed it. So, as far as I was concerned, he was good. In case something happened.
Can you fly this plane and land it?
Surely you can't be serious.
And it was good for him to come along, because I don't know, I can't remember how many hours we flew on this particular trip, but it was quite a bit. Anyway, we left on August the 22nd, 1978 from Delta Air Park. And we flew up to Quesnel. Now, to get up there, you could go up from Delta Air Park over North Van area up to Squamish, Whistler, Pemberton, Lillooet. Anyway, it just kept on going further and further north, and it was basically a VFR route. Anyway, we stopped in Quesnel for a fuel stop. The airplane I had, the Cub, it had about 6 hours range endurance. I had a tank in the root of the right wing, and it would flow into the tank, the front tank. So I had basically 2 tanks. So I'm sure it had 6 hours at least. 6 hours. Anyway, it was enough. You couldn't hold out that long. It was pretty long. Normally 4.5 hours is about the maximum that I could stay in an airplane. Anyway, we took off and we went to we headed up to Quesnel, got a fuel stop, and then we went to Prince George. Now, we were going to go up to Prince George right at the airport, but we thought, well, we landed at Prince George, where are we going to sleep? We found a little strip just outside of Prince George by a place called Tabor Lake. And Tabor Lake had a grass strip in there, not much of one. I think it also had a float plane base at some point, but anyway, we landed in Tabor Lake and it had grass. The grass on the runway was about a foot high. Not that that bothered us. Anyway, we overnighted there, and the next morning we woke up to the sound of drip, drip, drip. And what we'd done is the night previous we put a tarp underneath the wing and just put our sleeping bags on that and laid down and flaked out. Next morning we woke up and all we could hear was this drip, 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 and looked out and we couldn't see a damn thing. It was just socked right in. And the dew on the wing, the top of the wing, it was dribbling down to the trailing edge, and the trailing edge, it was dripping off the trailing edge, and the drips were laying right on our area where we were sleeping on the tarp, and all you could hear was this thud, 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 and it was the drops coming down. And of course, over the evening of that night, it got everything pretty wet. Anyway, needless to say, some of our sleeping bag areas were wet. We got up and thought, well, it's socked in. Obviously, we're not going anywhere, but we figured the sun would probably burn it off. Which eventually, an hour or 2 hours later, I can't recall, off we went. And as we were coming into the Prince George area, one of our Boeing 737s was coming in from Fort St. John, and I think the routing it had was Edmonton, Grand Prairie, Fort St. John, Prince George, and then Vancouver. It was a real milk run type thing. He missed, couldn't get in. I thought, well, this doesn't look good. How am I going to get in? He's doing an ILS. Anyway, I came in, I looked at it, and as we were coming in, I looked down and I thought, well, that looks like the runway down there. It was the south end of the runway. It had a nice big number on it, and it looked good, so I landed on it. Yep, that was Prince George. So we taxied and found our way eventually to the terminal area where there was the gas pumps, and we fueled up. I think everybody was scratching their head how the heck we ever got there, and I still don't recall how we got there either. You're gonna have to pardon me, people, folks. I've had this dry cough in my chest for about a week now, and it's a real bugger trying to talk at the same time. Anyway, we took off out of Prince George and headed up to Fort St. John. The weather was not good. It started raining, and Mike was awful concerned over the fact that we were pretty low over the highway, which we were, because you could see the 18-wheelers down below us out there, and we kept on going. I said, all we do have to do is get across this little pass area out there by a place called Chetwind, and I said then it'll open up into a big open area of plains, just plain. There's the mountains. We were pretty well out of them by that point. So that's what happened. Things opened up and off we went up to Fort St. John. Now we landed in Fort St. John, and we talked to one of the locals out there, and we said, hey, look, we want to stay overnight out here. We're just going to fuel up, and you got a place, is there a place up here where we can basically tie down and overnight? And he said, there's a nice little strip just out there by Charlie Lake, which wasn't more than a 15-minute flight out of Fort St. John. He says it's a one-way strip, but he says there's a campground right beside it, and and I said, oh, that's great. And he said, well, you got to take one thing into consideration, that when you're coming in out there, he says one-way strip, so you come in over the lake, and then the Alaska Highway. So the Alaska Highway is right beside it. So, and I said, okay, fine. Anyway, and across from that was a Husky, I think it was a Husky service station. So we landed. Unfortunately, the tail wheel locked into a position I couldn't get it out of, and it was into a left-hand turn. Now, mind you, Mike sitting in the front doesn't know what's going on, other than the fact that all of a sudden the airplane is heading towards a runway marker. Now, the runway markers, they were like a roof of a house. They were shaped like this, like that. They were laying along the side. They were about 4 feet long, and they were on sort of a stand. So they were maybe a couple of feet off the ground. And I headed right for one of them. Not that I wanted to, and there's nothing I could do about it. It didn't matter how hard I kicked the rudder over, the tail wheel, nothing. And then, as soon as I got close to one of these things, the prop nicked the top of the runway marker, and as soon as it hit it, the whole damn thing collapsed. But it collapsed with just enough forward movement that I had in the airplane to wedge itself underneath the airplane, right underneath the landing gear. Now the landing gear in the Cub is like this. So the roof was basically right here, just, right. Anyway, that's where the landing gear fit right over top of that roof. And that at the same time knocked the brake line, hit the brake line that was on my landing gear and knocked that off. So there went my brakes, so I couldn't do anything. And I was at the mercy of, well, basically the whatever. I just come to a stop, hopefully. Now by that time I'd already thrown all the switches and the lights, the engine was off, and the gasoline, the switches for the gas were off, and we kept on going. And with that forward momentum and the runway marker wedged underneath the airplane, it put us into a right turn all of a sudden. And by putting us in a right turn, the nose of the airplane was now pointing towards the side of the runway. And that particular side of the runway was on a hill. So down the hill we went backwards. The runway was over here. And beyond that was a big open field. But where the airplane was heading was down the hill. And it was a slope, I'd say something like about this. And it had all bushes, about 5 feet high. And now the airplane's sliding down backwards. And at the bottom of the hill was a fence. The airplane just kept on sliding down, and every time it hit a bush, I could see dollar signs. Because I figured, there goes that, there goes the fabric, there goes this is going to be bent, the strut's going. Didn't know what the heck was happening. I get down the bottom of the hill, and there was a bit of a thud, and we came to a stop. So Mike and I got into the airplane, and we inspected it. Now, of course, all the bushes and everything that were up on the hill that we'd come through had already went back to their original position. And the tail of the airplane was expected to be just bent all out of shape because whatever it hit. Well, it turned out what it hit was a fence post. And the rudder hit the fence post, kind of like this. And as soon as it hit the fence post, the whole damn fence fell over. About 30 feet of fence fell over. Now it was a post, then wire, those square type wires, to another post, maybe about another 20 feet further. So at least 2 or 3 poles had fallen over, so it had to be probably 40 feet of fence had fallen over, and the whole damn fence just went flop. And obviously what had happened was the posts had rotted along the bottom where it hit the ground, and I was just fortunate that the impact of what I hit it with was enough to knock the whole fence over. So I was quite fortunate. So there was very little damage. There was a little nick on the fabric where the fabric goes around the back of the tube from the rudder, and it put a little scratch in there, and that was it. But now the problem was we had to get back up the hill and park the airplane on the other side of the runway. And the only way we could do that was to unload the airplane, because it was heavy. We'd just fueled up at Fort St. John, and we'd only flown for maybe 15 minutes, so it was quite heavy. And we had to push this thing up this hill through these bushes. So fortunately we had an axe with us, and we chopped down some of the bushes that we needed to, and the shrubs. And Mike and I got on one side of the strut, and we pushed up one way, and then somebody held it, blocked the wheel. Then we did the same thing on the other side, and so on, and we got it up sort of on an angle this way, and we finally got it up on the hill and up on the runway and pushed it out to an area where we could tie it down. Now fortunately, we had some connections in Fort St. John, having that we've been there before, and we used to fly through there. Like we used to do these what was called route familiarization flights, and we'd go with the crew and we go through the whole BC district and the Yukon, and you would be talking to the operational people out there quite a bit. And anyway, so bottom line is we had some connections up there that we knew, and they knew us. Across the street from the airport, it's the Alaska Highway, which was at the end of the strip, was a Husky truck stop. So we went over to the Husky truck stop. Actually, I think we even had a bite to eat up there. But we phoned up the airport, talked to an agent that we knew, and said blah, 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 and, you know, explained the situation. Can you switch us over to maintenance? And they did, and we got a hold of another individual we knew that there. And we said, this is our situation. Can we have somebody come out, maybe tomorrow or whenever you have time, to see what you can do about getting us out of this mess? Well, he knew somebody that was in the light aircraft maintenance and phoned him up. He said, yep, I can be out there. I said, well, before you come out here, I said, check at the counter and see if there's a parcel there for us, which would probably be a new propeller. And he said, okay, fine. So next morning, he came back, and sure as heck, he picked up a propeller. And the propeller came from a small aviation business in Richmond, which was right near the airport in Vancouver. What I had done is I'd phoned up somebody that I knew, again, in Vancouver, that was in the shop, and I said, look, this is what I need. I need a prop for a 65 horsepower Cub. Do you have one? Yep, we got one. I said, good. I said, can you get it over to the airport and ship it AOG to Fort St. John on CP Air? And AOG, I don't know if you folks know what that means. I'm sure most of you do, but for those that don't, AOG means aircraft on ground, and it's priority freight. So usually it means the company that requires it is in desperate need of these parts. So, but they, of course, that would only be for CP Air aircraft, not for my private aircraft. But in those days, things were a little more slack, I guess. So he came to the airport, dropped the prop off, and he said, it's AOG. And of course, they didn't know what was in it. It was a big long box, and it was probably about 80, 90 inches long, and it was probably about this wide, like that, cardboard, and then it had a wooden post of something in it to hold everything together. And anyway, he picked up that at the ticket counter at the freight department in Fort St. John, and he brought it down. And of course, I didn't have the tools to remove the prop. You know, it was all wire locked and stuff like that, and I didn't have all that stuff with me, and nor was I qualified to even remove the prop. I mean, not that under those conditions, I probably would have done it, but anyway, I didn't have the tools anyway. And of course, the bolts have to be torqued, and anyway, I got the prop repaired, and then he fixed the brake line, and he kind of hammered the tail wheel back into a reasonable straight position because it goes on a spring, and it kind of, the spring mounting kind of moved over to one side, and it's in a bracket. But anyway, bottom line is it was fixed. Now we had to get out of there. Now, like I said, it was a one-way strip, so you come in one way and you take off the other way. Same way you came in. I mean, it's uphill, so obviously you're going to take off downhill. So I said to Mike, I said, well, Mike, I said, I don't know. I said, this prop is different than the one I had on here. The RPM on this prop, I can't go over the red line with it. It just goes to a certain amount, and it was a heck of a lot less. I was surprised how many RPM less it was. And I felt, oh man, this engine doesn't have the poop to get airborne off this small strip with 2 guys on board, full fuel and all the goodies. So I said, I'm gonna run it up. We'll put the whole airplane in the tail of the airplane in the ditch, which was the end of the runway. And I said, and then I'll just run it up as much as I can. I had the brakes, it was almost with the ass end of the airplane going up. Off we went, and I thought we were never getting airborne. And I told Mike, I said, look, we're gonna use every inch of runway because it's sort of one of these, you're gonna go or you're not gonna go. You know, I mean, there was no abort, it was just you were gonna go. And so as we were getting near the end of the runway, I just pulled the stick back a little bit more and a little bit more, and finally it got airborne. And wouldn't you know it, there's this wide open field, and at the end of that field, I mean, it must have been 50-acre field, and right on the approach to that runway, or on the departure into that runway, as I was flying and trying to climb, there's this massive tree. I mean, it was massive. It was the only tree on the whole field. And I was heading right for it. So now I thought, well, we're not going to get over top of this tree. So I made a gradual little bank, not much, because I was just above the stall speed of this airplane, the way it felt. And I kind of played with it, and you could feel it trying to fall off. And anyway, we missed the tree. We stayed overnight in a tent, and just on the other side of this fence that had fallen down through the bush, there was a park. It was a provincial park or national park, I can't remember, but it had campsites in it, and there was a few people there, not many, because it was cold. It was August and it was raining. Anyway, we found a campsite, and it was on gravel. We put this little orange tent down, and we went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up. Mike was laying on the right side, no, on the left side. I was on the right side. And I don't know if you've heard this movie. It's called The River Runs Through It. Well, it was running through my sleeping bag because that night it rained like heck. And we were on a bit of a slope, I think, on that gravel. And the water had come down, and it went down the beginning of the opening of the tent in the front, and it just came on down. Mike was on the higher side, and I was on the lower side, so needless to say, my sleeping bag was just soaked. It was just soaked. And I was cold. Anyway, so we finally got up, and now, of course, we had to dry everything up. So we built this fire. Of course, all the wood was wet. So we found as much dry wood as we could, went out to the airplane, got some aviation fuel, and dumped it all over the logs that we had, and set that on fire, and poof, went up. And finally we got enough fire and branches over it so that we could put our sleeping bags and everything else that was wet and try to get it semi-dry, because it never really did dry out. So that is basically how we spent the night. It wasn't very comfortable, I can tell you that. We ended up flying out, as I mentioned earlier, and we went to Dawson Creek because I wanted to land and just see exactly how landing on pavement would work with this Cub. Well, we landed, and the tail wheel still wasn't right. So we had another maintenance guy out there sort of fix the tail wheel up, and we ended up getting that remedied. And then we bombed off and phoned up a friend of ours that lived out in Grand Prairie. He said, "Yo, come on down, you can spend the night and we'll have a few drinks and so forth." So we went out to Grand Prairie. Dawson Creek to Grand Prairie, thunderstorms. And there was just a horrendous thunderstorm. You could see it coming at you. It was coming out from the south and moving its way across towards the north. And it wasn't pretty. And I don't know, I was, I mean, the cell was right there, and we had nowhere to go. We had to just basically blast in, so I just firewalled it and shoved the nose forward, and we blasted off and landed in Grand Prairie. And just as we landed, tied the airplane down, we had a downpour like you wouldn't believe. Anyway, this friend of ours picked us up, and we went over and spent the night with him, had a few drinks. Next morning, he took us back to the airport, and we went, basically went south, back to Vancouver. The reason why we did this is because everything from Fort St. John, Fort Nelson, Watson Lake, Whitehorse, it was just down in just real crummy weather. So we said, well, we're not going to go anywhere. It was terrible. And so we kept on going south where the weather was a lot better. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that, folks, because my throat's getting awful dry, and I've got a bit of a cold here, so it's starting to affect me because every once in a while I have to cough.
Well, folks, the rest of the trip was pretty uneventful. We ended up leaving Grand Prairie, went back via Fort St. John. We didn't stop there. We overnighted in Chetwynd. I was right at Chetwynd Airport, and they had a few of these old trailers there that they leased out and to mining companies, but they were just in storage there, so we stayed in one of these. And then in between each unit was a washroom, which obviously wasn't connected to anything, but yeah, it was pretty good. At least we had a good night's sleep there. We each had our own bedrooms, you might say. Then from there we flew down to Barkersville. Now that's a very unique. Well, we stayed overnight in Barkersville, actually, I should say. We had a very nice campfire right on the airport, and the airstrip is actually right beside the road, and it's within walking distance to the to Barkersville. So it's actually quite convenient if you have an aircraft. You can fly in there. The town of Barkerville is about 80 kilometers east of Quesnel, and then from Quesnel, or rather than from Barkerville, we flew to Williams Lake, fueled up, and then from Williams Lake we flew down back to over the Chilliwack, Abbotsford area, and back into Delta Air Park. And as you can see, one of the young ones was waiting for me out there. That was my eldest, and she was quite happy to see me. So anyway, that's about it, folks. I'm glad you could come along and view this exotic trip we had. At least we thought it was. And so the same old thing. If you so desire, just hit that subscribe button, and I'd really appreciate it. So we'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.